everybody, and welcome back to another fun filled week of discussion in gender, sexuality, and women's studies. This week, we're thinking about how political economic structures impact social justice efforts. So, we're thinking about how our capitalist contexts both produce the conditions for systemic privilege and oppression, as well as how they impact efforts toward dismantling those forms of systemic privilege and oppression. So, a few keywords that are going to frame this discussion are diversity, racial capitalism, and commodity or popular feminisms. So, let's start with diversity and thinking about how one of our writers this week is thinking through the language of diversity. So, Sarah Ahmed talks about how the language of diversity is often taken up by university institutions as a way to relieve themselves of the responsibility to actually put diversity into practice. So, what does she mean by that? She's thinking about how, with diversity brochures and diversity committees and very well crafted email statements that, discuss universities' commitment to diversity, that works to deflect from actually taking action on, dismantling white supremacy at the university, actually taking care of issues like pay inequities, all of the things that would actually be putting diversity into practice, or putting a commitment to diversity, I should say, into practice. We see this cycle happen often at universities that, folks in this class may be familiar with, where student activists will name various issues at a university. So, they'll point out how universities are taking over local properties and expanding and displacing local residents, otherwise understood as, universities' role in gentrification. So they'll also point out, the immense amount of funding that goes to campus police, and how those resources can be redistributed toward, different productive student activities, towards, various jobs and, pay equity for those jobs. So, there are a lot of issues that, I'm sure you're all familiar with, that student activists will name that are connected to issues of diversity. And what tends to happen, to speak to the cycle I was referring to, is that after student activists will name these various issues, we'll see institutions push back against them. They'll do the whole rigmarole where, they're like, no, we're not going to address that. They're not actually facing the issue head on. And then more and more pressure is placed on them to take note of the issue. And then they might finally cave. And what they wind up doing is, assembling some form of a committee to look into those issues. And then the student activists will put in all this work to, produce reports for the committee, to get, other important figures on the committee, and make final recommendations to the university through the committee. Then the student activists will graduate, and the recommendations, or whatever final report is created through said committee, is disregarded by the institution. So it kind of operates as a band-aid to actually meaningfully address the issues that student activists are, trying to shine a spotlight on. So with that cycle, it really speaks to the ways that, Sarah Ahmed is pointing out, the language of diversity, and just essentially, speaking about diversity, creating committees about it. It's, this superficial way of actually, addressing the issues. And the speaking about the issues, supplants actually, doing something about it. So I'm curious what you all think about that, and we'll talk about that a little bit on the discussion board, examples that where you've seen that happening. But, the language of diversity is intertwined with this concept of racial capitalism that Nancy Leong points to in one of the articles this week. And we see racial capitalism take shape not only, on university campuses, but also at major corporations like Walmart or Target and whatnot. And racial capitalism essentially refers to how diversity is profitable. So, photoshopping people of color into pictures, spending all of this money on pamphlets and brochures that give the illusion that, the university is very committed to diversity, that a company is very committed to diversity. But then, you look behind the scenes of that, particular institution and you see that they're not, hiring people of color, they're, not paying people of color equitable wages. They're like condoning hostile work environments that are reinforcing various forms of white supremacy at, their corporations and institutions. So, we see how in those situations diversity is basically just something, that operates in such a way that value is extracted from non-white people and then, goes into producing value for the company, but that company is really only invested in reinforcing the familiar dynamics of, their institution, and they're not necessarily looking to use diversity as a mechanism for, taking action to change the structure of their institution. So, this is definitely intertwined with Sarah Benet Weiser, another writer for this week, is thinking about how these principles take shape for feminism. And she's thinking about how, we have commodified feminism in the sense that we have turned feminism into a profitable venture that is driven by commercialization. So a key example of that comes to mind immediately is, somebody like Bella Hadid wearing a "This is what a feminist looks like" t-shirt, and people seeing that as, oh wow, that's so amazing that, this particular product that an influencer is wearing is demonstrating their politics. But, commodity feminism essentially is the principle that the buck stops with, the product that you buy that demonstrates your politics. So it's not necessarily putting those politics into action, but it's just purchasing something that's a demonstration of one's politics. So we also see this principle at play as well with rainbow capitalism. People may be, familiar with this concept as well, but rainbow capitalism is essentially this notion that, during Pride Month each year, so, June tends to be, Pride Month, and we see corporations and various people purchasing rainbow items to demonstrate their support for the LGBTQ plus community. And often corporations will go all out with, trying to demonstrate that, they are an LGBTQ friendly company, but they're not necessarily behind the scenes taking steps to, make LGBTQ plus employees feel included in, the various dynamics of the company. Things aren't necessarily being put into practice beyond, decorating things with rainbows. So it's a very kind of, superficial expression or superficial commitment to, a particular marginalized community. And the same goes for, how consumers during Pride Month may, buy things that have rainbows and whatnot, but, their politics may start and end with purchasing those things. So I want to emphasize that, this is an issue that can be looked at through a both and lens, in the sense that, one can both purchase products from businesses that they see as, reflecting values of diversity, reflecting values of social justice, and putting, their politics into action. A major critique of, that's emerging from the writers this week is when one's politics, or when a company's politics or an individual's politics starts and ends with purchasing things, it starts and ends with issuing a statement. So it's looking at those very cosmetic or, superficial aspects of expressing politics. And we'll talk about this a little bit more on the discussion board. But I'm also curious how, and because, we've talked about Me Too and, the Me Too movement in this class a fair bit, and thinking about how that's, a great example of, for instance, the commercialization of feminism. So celebrities, essentially changing the meaning of that movement, and shifting it from an effort that was led by women of color, that was, centered on sustainable action, to eradicate sexual violence, and then, sort of morphed into this commercialized venture with apps and cookies and different products that were intended to, shine a spotlight on sexual violence and whatnot. So thinking about how there's a lot of complicated dynamics at play to pushing efforts for social justice forward in, a consumer society, in the, the current capitalist society that we are living in, and thinking about how when profit takes precedence, which is the political economic context that we're living in, where profit is deemed as king, thinking about how that impacts the struggle to, push the, various dynamics of social justice forward that we're discussing in this class. So we'll talk about that more on the discussion board, and I look forward to it.